Ladies and gentlemen, while he may be the most dapper dressed man on YouTube and Twitch alike, he unfortunately supports the Imperium in Warhammer 40k, so I have trouble with the fact that I actually really like this guy and the content that he puts out. Josh Strife Hayes at 1.25% speed all the way back in 2020, talking about is Final Fantasy XIV worth it in 2021? The goal here being to view this from 2022. Here we are in Endwalker, so we have knowledge that he does not, and view this as a jumping off point of diving into is Final Fantasy still worth it today based on the values that maybe as a community we would have had looking forward. Is hindsight really 2020? Maybe he saw some things that panned out differently. I think a lot of the things that he's talked about in this video still ring true today.
2020 wasn't a fun reality, so you'd be forgiven for wanting to run off and live 2021 inside a virtual one. But with so many online games to choose from, which are worth your time and which are wastes of money? Let's find out. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Strife Hayes, and today I'll be answering the question, should you play Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn in 2021? We'll be looking at several areas of the game and then deciding if it's worth playing. Before we begin, if you could do me a favor and drop a like on the video, then consider subscribing to the channel or clicking the bell icon for more MMO content. And a massive thank you to all my supporters on Patreon and Twitch who make all my videos possible. Right.
That list has gotten so much longer as Josh has just continued to put out an incredible amount of incredible quality content.
Let's play some FF14. Final Fantasy XIV is an interesting game. Originally releasing in 2010, it was shut down because it was awful. Then they rebuilt it from the ground up and rebranded it as A Realm Reborn, and now it's really good. It's available on PC, Mac, PS3, and PS4, although the PS3 version is being slowly phased out, so you should ignore that one. The amazing thing...
So there is a question about platforms there, now that we only support PS4 and forward. And so people naturally say PS4 and PS5 are supported. When is PS4 going to get dropped? Is that in 7.0? I do not expect that to be in 7.0. I want to remind you that PS3 was supported for, I believe, 3 years after the PS4 version came online. And the PS5 version was plagued with them being very well aware that moving to PS5 was not just an issue of does somebody have the money, do they want to move to PS5, but it's also been something where a huge number of people were not able to get their hands on a PS5 and maybe still cannot, depending on where you live and all of that. Over on Twitter, when I was traveling, I actually tweeted out like a whole pallet of PS5s that I came across in an airport. And so like they are out there in the world, but Final Fantasy is aware that that's not been an easy transition. So I would say don't expect PS4 to be dropped during 7.0. It would not shock me if it is dropped going into 8.0, which puts it a ways out. Also keep in mind for the people who typically bring up comparisons between console and PC, they think about their PC, which might have a 3080 or a 3090 or something even, more powerful, some mega graphics card and all this. They got 82 billion gig of RAM, the most solid of state drives, and they're so excited about this, and they're like, PC Master Race, it's so much better than console. But remember that the console platform as a whole for MMOs supports all the way down to the bottom spec, and these games are meant to be very inviting to people on much older machines. And so that is something we would likely see updated at the same time that we saw PS4 drop support.
About the game is it's fully cross-platform, meaning all players from all platforms play together on the same servers. PlayStation 4 players, Mac players, and PC players are all gaming together on the same world. As long as you're on the same realm as your friend, regardless of platform you're playing on, you will be playing together.
To take that even one step further, it is also cross-save. So you actually have the ability to save your settings and your character across multiple platforms. One caveat to that when he gets to talking about pricing here is that you would have to purchase a license for each of those copies. So I, for example, own a PlayStation and a Mac copy of the game all the way through Shadowbringers, and I own Endwalker on my PC client. So if on those clients, while I can already log on to them and check my market board and my retainers, I can play in any zone that is not an Endwalker zone. If I wanted to be able to move that character into Endwalker content, I would need to buy those licenses on those platforms, or I need to only log in on my PC, and that does mean that when I log out, I always try to log out from a location that I know I'll be able to log back in on a different platform. So with that cross-save, it really is different, and then on any of those platforms, you can play on brilliant controller support or brilliant keyboard and mouse support, regardless of platform.
As for the cost, this is where things get a bit more complex. This has changed recently, so I'm going to give you the most up-to-date information we have right now. Up until very recently, Final Fantasy XIV was a monthly subscription game, but due to recent generous changes, you can now create a free trial account. This free trial account can experience a massive amount of the game, including the entire core main game and the whole first expansion, Heaven's Ward, for free. From level 1 up to 60 in all jobs, but there are restrictions to this trial. All restrictions are listed on the website, and they include no trading with other players, no more than one character per world, and no using the player-to-player market board. Unfortunately, if you have an old character that used to be a paid monthly sub, you cannot convert it to a free trial character. You need to start a new character to get the free trial. Once you've played through the good 500-hour core game and Heaven's Ward expansions, the monthly subscription is around £9 or $13, which is super reasonable given the quality of the game.
So, there is a question of should I just jump in and buy the expansions? For example, if you were playing Guild Wars 2 and the expansions were on sale, I would consider telling you yes. If you're playing World of Warcraft where the free trial gives out very, very quickly, I would tell you if money is not the issue, go ahead and dive in immediately. But with Final Fantasy, I will note that the vast majority of content in this game is locked behind some level of quest progression, the majority of those quests being part of a chain called the Main Scenario Quest, or MSQ. So by having to progress through MSQ for all of that base expansion, and then, of course, the actual first expansion, Heaven's Word, we refer to those as 2.0 and 3.0 because 1.0 is what we call that stuff that got kind of put to the side, and we're sorry about that. And so with that 2.0 and 3.0 being required, a lot of those hundreds of hours he's talking about, I know that the base game of just the 2.0 storyline, not even the 2.1 patch content, took me somewhere around 52 hours to replay through on a new character and really enjoy and get to know. So I would say that if you plan on enjoying the story in this game, which would be the recommended and preferred path, you should consider going ahead and picking up the free trial first, unless the restrictions that he listed there and are shown on the website are absolutely driving you insane. Maybe you do want to, if you and a friend play together, you can't really party up if you're both on free trials. So one of you needs to pay so they can invite the other one to their party. So there's some goofiness if like a whole group of you get in with free trials at the same time. But otherwise, I would stay on that all the way until it starts to limit you, which is all the way at the end of Heaven's Word, 3.55 patch content. It'll tell you with a big thing, you finished Heaven's Word, now you need to move to Stormblood. Or sooner if one of the restrictions on there is absolutely driving you crazy, like the fact that you can't do PvP, or you can't get into using the market board, or you're running into the fact that you only hold 300,000 gil, etc.
Final Fantasy XIV is set in the magical land of Eorzea. New players to the Final Fantasy franchise will be happy to know that the games, despite sharing the Final Fantasy name, are not actually a single chronological adventure. Each one is an independent experience with a few superficial similarities, meaning you can start with FF14 and not be missing out on anything. The land of Eorzea itself is vast, covering multiple environments and biomes, from secluded treetop canopies to murky swamps or dry arid desert mesas. The city you start in will be determined by your starting class, but no matter where you start, it will look gorgeous. The lighting effects, character models, combat animations, and music are just stunningly high quality, everything we've come to expect from Final Fantasy games. In fact, one of the reasons the original FF14 didn't do too well was because the graphics were too good, and even tiny insignificant objects had a massive amount of polygons. There was an interview with the creator a while ago where he said a background flower pot had 10,000 polygons, which was the same count as the character models. If you want to see what your PC can really do or what the PlayStation 4 is really capable of, Final Fantasy XIV on max graphics will put it through its paces.
They have actually since also continued to update these, so past Josh, don't worry, it got even better. They are talking about actually being at the very edge of what they can do with the current graphics without going back and revisiting textures, revisiting the way the game is rendered. It used to be that one of the big capital cities looked like it was melting from a certain draw distance just a little bit, and that's since been cleaned up. But as we've gotten to the very limits of what can be done with the existing assets in game, you may be looking at this and saying, there's games of today that look so much better. They've talked about going back and revisiting that. That will be a process that will likely take at least one full expansion from today, most likely more. And they've actually come out and already pre-apologized to say there might be some moments where you may see that the ground clutter, for example, gets updated, the grass texture gets updated, but maybe that bush behind Adelard here is not updated. And so there may be some moments as we transition to this where you come from what Josh is describing as looking really good to the next generation of graphics for this game. And they've actually shown those off in one of their regular community interviews, which are called live letters. They do at least 2 of those for every single patch. We get at least 5. We get 5 full patches for every single expansion, in addition to the expansion content. And then in addition to that, we get a bunch of other communication. So it will be a process that we will be constantly made aware of. We will constantly be what is coming next. If you want to know any of that stuff, we sum up live letters either here on Gaming Kinda or over on my other channel, Work to Game, where I talk about that with my friend Brian.
Attention to detail and high quality is obvious from the very start with the character creator. When creating a character, you'll first be able to choose your race. You've got the human-like nomadic Hyor, the sleek and graceful elfin-like Elizan, the equal parts adorable and insufferable Lalafell, the cat-like Mikoti, the super buff Rogadin, and the scaly Aura. Each race is visually different, and the variety gives the whole game a seriously fantastical feel. You've also got 2 premium races locked behind the expansion packs, which we'll look at later.
So, Viera, it used to be gender-locked to female. It has now had a male Viera added as well. Hrothgar will be getting a female counterpart at some point in the future, I would assume with the launch of 7.0. And these other races, you might decide one and then realize you want to change. That is done through a race change potion called a Fantasia. Fantasias are something that 1 or 2 or so are given to you throughout the story as you complete. So if you pick one of these in the free trial and you know that you're going to want to switch to these lion guys, Hrothgar, or these bunny girls, Viera, which now are going to hopefully both one day offer the female and male counterpart, not just Viera, you could do that, theoretically, right? When you buy the expansion that allows those to be your selection, you could apply a Fantasia to yourself and swap over. That is the #1 sold item in the cosmetic shop that supports this game in addition to the subscription, because the subscriptions of this game are the same as they've always been. I've been around since A Realm Reborn. They really don't increase that, even though I'm sure those developers want to have increases in salary. The cost of server costs and everything else has done nothing but go up like everything else in our lives. But the subscription staying the same means there is a very large cosmetic store to support the already enormous amount of customization within the game at no additional cost.
Each race can play as any class, so this is purely an aesthetic choice. Pick what you think looks cool. Character creation is ridiculously detailed, letting you customize not only your hair and height, but the very whites of your eyes or the color around them. If you think I'm joking, here is actual footage of me customizing my eye accent colors.
Look at all of these things on the left side. I don't know that he makes note of this, but like these are all of the other things. The ability to adjust height, the ability to adjust kind of your body type, to pick the voice that your character is going to be shouting with. This is something that not every major MMO is able to build in at this level. It is also something that restricts the way the gear and stuff fits. So with Hrothgar and Viera, the 2 added races, be aware that not every headpiece will equip to them visually, because designing a piece of gear that can stretch and adjust as necessary is much more expensive than something like, say, World of Warcraft, where while they, yes, have a dozen or so races, those races are always of a fixed body type. So you don't sit here and drag the tail length and the height and, you know, all of these different things that allow these sliders to adjust the size and shape of your character.
Final Fantasy XIV is a stupidly high-detailed game. As for classes, Final Fantasy XIV does something I really like, and that's not restrict you. While you may start the game as one thing, you are not limited to it. FF14 calls its classes Disciples of War for the fighter classes, Disciples of Magic for all the spellcasters, and the crafting is broken down into Disciples of the Land for gathering and Disciples of the Hand for making stuff. And while you may begin the game as an archer or a gladiator or a conjurer, that's not what you will stay as. Leveling through your individual job's storyline will unlock new abilities for that job, but to switch jobs or classes, all you need to do is switch weapons. This means...
And at level 30, he's referring to these as classes and showing these off. At level 30, we move into a system called jobs. One of the classes becomes 2 jobs, but as a typical rule, each class is going to get its job, and it's never going to look back. So if you are looking at other videos in the space, we tend to refer to things as jobs, because from level 30 content on, that is what they are. They stay those jobs forever and ever. And those are kind of acted as specializations, but unlike other games, they tried out one class of having 2 specializations and never did it again. And all new jobs that we get added to the game don't even get base classes, they just get jobs added. This is something that they have historically added. Kind of we've seen the trend of right now you would expect 2 jobs every expansion. At this point, it's getting to, I think, 20 base battle jobs plus Blue Mage. and then 8 base crafters and 3 gatherers. And so with all of that, you're starting to get to the point where to keep them all feeling unique and yet balanced and well supported and well documented, we have seen them officially move away from having individual storylines post level 70 and move into supporting them with role quests. We got kind of a little bit of flavor, and that's it. At 80 and then at 90, they've dropped totally into being sorted by role, which is where you have tanks, healers, DPS. The DPS is broken into melee, physical ranged, and magical ranged. And they're kind of getting put in these tidy little groups. They share gear across them, which is very, very nice when you're leveling up a character that fits inside a role. But on the downside of that, it does mean that like a warrior, for example, is always a tank in this game and will always be played the same as every other warrior in the game, as opposed to the customization of something like, say, World of Warcraft or Guild Wars 2, which are the 2 other MMOs that I'm going to jump to compare here. But there are, of course, many other MMOs that allow for customization of the way a particular class plays.
Means you only need one character to experience absolutely everything the game has to offer, and if you're fighting an enemy that's weak against a certain combat style, you can come back geared up with that style. This also means if you're playing with a group of friends and one of you gets bored of tanking, you can switch whenever you need to. I absolutely love the freedom of this system. Once you've reached the basic version of a class to a certain level, you can complete a special quest and evolve it into a better version. The archer becomes a bard, the lancer becomes a dragoon. It's basically a new name and a slightly different set of abilities, showing you are a more elite version of that class. As for the combat system, this is where I'll get some hate in the comments. Final Fantasy XIV has great combat. Eventually. The endgame dungeons and harder bosses will see you and a large team of players pulling off amazing feats of combat skill, using many special attacks and chaining together abilities to form massive damage, dodging, healing, defending, and attacking fluidly within dynamic and exciting fights, and it's actually super enjoyable at the end game. However, the first 20 or 30 hours of combat are, in my opinion, super dull. You've got your basic auto attack and a single activated ability which you'll spam until you get a second, but most abilities, especially in the early game, all use the global cooldown timer, meaning activating one places all of them onto a short cooldown. Usually this means you have to pick and choose which ability to use in a given situation, but at the start it means you'll just be slowly cycling through 2 or 3 buttons for several hours. To be clear, Final Fantasy XIV's combat is graphically beautiful and mechanically solid, and it does get good, but it does not start good.
Okay, so on combat, I have some good news and some bad news for 2020 Josh. The good news is that they have gone back and started revisiting this. We have seen them go back with jobs in Endwalker and say, you know what, we need to revisit these from the ground up, not just make them better from this point moving forward, meaning from the current max level forward, but also looking back at the way they level. A big part of that being that when we go back and do old content as max level characters for rewards, they incentivize that so that we go back and help new players who need help when they get to group stages of the MSQ. And so to do that, but not make those new players feel like they're just being dragged along by these people with elite abilities, we actually get dropped down to the level of that content, which means that not only does a class not feel good on the way up as it slowly improves, not only through just the natural progression of levels and your character getting stronger, but also as the game systems itself and the developers got better and more interesting in making classes, hopefully each expansion for the better. That is their aim. But we regularly sink back down. So if a job, for example, does not feel good at level 35, you're not just done with it once you're level 50. You're going to go back and re-experience that level 35 pain every single time you queue for what we call roulettes, these random dungeons, and you get pulled into content that is level 35 or lower. So that is something that they've gone back and started revisiting. But we do still have a heavily 2.5 second global cooldown. That idea of a cooldown between spells is very common in MMOs. It helps with latency. It helps with skill balance. It helps with a lot of things. It's not a perfect solution, but it is a common solution. But Final Fantasy XIV picks up a lot of this pace because it moves into what are called off the global cooldown abilities, OGCDs. And so the ability to weave those between gets to where on classes you are putting 1 or even 2 abilities in between. So when you are early in this game, especially for free trial players who won't make it to the point that they're getting to like these double weaving epic fights, just imagine that when you're watching his combat here and he pushes 1 and then 3 and then 1 and then 3, that in between it would be 1, 4, 5, 3. And so it would be these really fast abilities. You get into things that are more reactionary. And there are some jobs that are more based on like proc chances, so it's constantly changing and you have a skill priority. There are others that are much more rhythmic and you're balancing this big rotation, like becoming really good at something like Guitar Hero, but you're doing that as you respond to the boss.
To get into the meat of the game though, you've got a vast amount of content available, from randomized boss battle roulettes to organized dungeons, or even joining in with the localized fate battles, which are reoccurring battle challenges out in the open world. Final Fantasy XIV has a lot to offer, it just takes its sweet time getting to the good bit. Now, despite being one of the most played MMORPGs in history, Final Fantasy XIV takes itself extremely seriously as a solo story. If you're after a game that encourages you to rush to the high-level content and join your friends doing mindless dungeon run after dungeon run, then don't even consider playing this game. It can actually help to look at this game as more of a solo, classic, single-player Final Fantasy with heavy multiplayer elements. The game starts with a cutscene and then continues with a cutscene, and pretty much the entire way through it's told via cutscenes, and my god are some of them quite long. You might even get warnings because of how long they are. This game rivals Metal Gear Solid for extremely long cutscenes. The characters you meet on your journey will reoccur, switch sides, live, die, and generally change, and you're expected to connect to them and read all they have to say. This is a deep, involved RPG with a deep, involved story that needs you to get involved with it. If you spam click through all the text and just follow the quest descriptions and then wonder why the game feels so shallow, it's because the story is a primary factor of Final Fantasy XIV, and if you don't engage with the story, you'll be missing a massive chunk of the experience. The story itself also isn't bad. It's actually very good and extremely well written once it gets going, but again, this suffers the same flaw as combat. It takes a while to get going. The first few hours, potentially days if you're playing casually, will see you performing busy work in the starting city, picking up dropped rubbish, passing messages back and forth between people, performing emotes at local NPCs, generally doing all the things we consider non-heroic. And I understand why the game does this. It's to set up the slow but eventual rise to global hero, but you must be prepared as a player for the opening of this game to be extremely mundane and in some cases rather tedious. The early game quests are very simple. Talk to A, go and talk to B, deliver item C, or kill 3 low-level enemies. Brand new players to the MMORPG genre will appreciate the ease of access, but veteran players will feel somewhat coddled. Now, to the game's credit, it does have a top-notch in-game tutorial system, with every single new mechanic.
Alright, so he's getting into another topic there, but not only am I speaking from in the future to Josh at this point, but I'm also speaking from a point of view that is less common within the community. Most of the people in this community have gotten here either through being Final Fantasy fans or other Final Fantasy MMO fans, and so many of the established veteran players in this community love and adore this game for the story, or come here from other games with the purpose of enjoying this game for story because the other games don't focus as heavily on story being so front and center. While other games may have great story, it is not as front and center driving the ship as it is in Final Fantasy XIV in most other MMOs, the genre in general. So I think a lot of WoW and Guild Wars players, while those games may have lore that they are very passionate about, may really appreciate the change of pace, with this being the thing you do first and always. But I came to this game as a previous World of Warcraft player in A Realm Reborn, and I found that I just wanted to be here for all the things he described. I wanted as maybe not something that would be enough to carry you. I came here to run dungeons with my friends, maybe dabble in a little PvP, get to know the incredibly deep and complex crafting and gathering systems, explore the world, and do all these open-based things, from going and interacting with sightseeing points to engaging in these fates, and above and beyond. There's roguelike towers you can climb, there's jump puzzles that you can do. There is a huge amount of content in this game that is not story, and I assume that I'm speaking on behalf of all the developers that work on every team within Square Enix, on every aspect of Final Fantasy XIV that is not story-driven, that their job is important, and that what they do is very cool, and they are passionate about it. And so while a lot of people focus on story, I have gotten into this game solely as a story skipper through A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormblood, and then I picked up the games as narrative for the first time in Shadowbringers. Shadowbringers was written to be something that could be enjoyed by, not only by the people who'd followed the story along through that point, but the initial expansion content of Shadowbringers was meant to be enjoyable standalone as well, and I really did enjoy it. As I got into the patch content and it started to make more callbacks, I started to get a little bit lost. Endwalker launched, which created the finale to the story from A Realm Reborn. The story ended, the game's over, and the game has picked back up with 6.1 and is beginning yet a new saga that our characters will continue to, but they wrapped everything up in a neat bow. So this is like getting a chance to watch a TV show that you already know ends, so you can binge it knowing that you're never going to get to a point where you're stuck on a cliffhanger without some resolution, because the end has been released. With that knowledge, going through Endwalker, enjoying it thoroughly, I was aware of all the moments that something happened, and it felt like that big reveal moment, and then I felt like, okay, I must be missing some context here. So I have since gone back and have been replaying through the story. If you want to experience that with me as I do voices and have a good time with that, that's over on Gaming Lore, kinda, as I get to know this game. But from this point of view, now enjoying A Realm Reborn, but not needing A Realm Reborn to have enjoyed the game thus far, I would tell you there are 3 paths to get into this game. The purest and most optimal path would be if you could enjoy the story the way that Josh is describing. Take your time, enjoy every single quest, and just know that everything they introduce into the game will have a payoff later down the road. So all the stuff they're setting aside, it's an enormous amount of things set aside. They've gotten better at voice acting, story pacing, combat pacing, the way they tell story, cutscene quality. They've gotten better at it, but it doesn't mean that they haven't continued to respect and build on what was there. So unfortunately, like watching the pilot episode of your favorite TV show, you have to watch that one for what it develops later on, because they don't have a previously on section at the beginning of every expansion. The second would be to go ahead and hop in and immediately jump to Heavensward. You can go back and you can watch old cutscenes from your inn, and you can watch those. You could watch story summaries over on YouTube. And if at any point you want the original version, there is a system in the game called New Game Plus that would allow you to replay all of that story content back through for no reward, but for the ability to experience the story for yourself. And they break each expansion into several chapters. This will also be something you can do to go re-experience class quests, role quests, etc. So it's actually a very deep and growing system to make sure that you can go back and re-experience the story it is. Unfortunately, as of right now, it has no real reward beyond the intrinsic reward of getting to the lore that you so crave. Now, the second method, being skip to Heavensward, where it picks up and then try to play some catch up and move on, would be kind of the I get it. I totally understand why you did this. It is less than perfection, but I think you've put yourself in a really good position to enjoy what this game has to offer. The next on-ramp, in my opinion, is Shadowbringers. So you would buy a story skip all the way up to Shadowbringers, boost your character up to that point, and then you would pick that up and enjoy the base game of Shadowbringers. As you get into the patch content of Shadowbringers, you would very quickly realize, okay, now they're starting to make references to things I don't know. At that point, I would strongly consider, if you are caring for the lore, to jump back and play that either through New Game Plus or a second character. There are very few reasons you need a second character, but that would be an alternative way to do that. The advantage of New Game Plus is that any open world content, you are wildly overpowered. You have access to all your jobs and gear that are that level or above, and then you also have all the teleports and the ability to fly around on your mount, so you get to things very, very, very quickly. Once again, New Game Plus does not offer rewards. That would allow you to get in. Now, I say all of this because Endwalker, the finale, is heavily geared at you having experienced at least one, but preferably all of the content, everything the game has to offer. The 24-man alliance raids, the 8-man raids, all of the trials, a lot of the side quests, many of the class and role quests, some of the side quests that build around unique, fun characters, and all of these optional dungeons. It makes references to everything. It is an enormous amount of fan service. It's meant to tie everything up in a bow so that with 6.1 we can begin a new adventure with our character, and any of the characters around that it makes sense would continue on with us. But it isn't just lip service that they say, yeah, and it'll be like a new adventure. No, it really does have, being here in the future, I can tell you it really does feel like a departure from 6.0. And so I would just tell you, with Endwalker, you want to be as prepared as possible to enjoy that. It is a hugely emotional expansion. And I think this game without story is enjoyable, but I do think that while story does not make all of my feelings fonder, especially when I disagree or I ethically struggle with some of the issues tackled in the story, it does make my feelings deeper. And so I would recommend those in that order. 1, experience the game that it is, know that it'll take a long time. 2, get in at Heavensward and blast straight through. I get it, A Realm Reborn is the slowest, but it's still beautiful and wonderful content. You may want to go back and do it at some point if the summaries or the videos in the end don't get you everything you need. And then lastly, I totally understand people who just get to Shadowbringers. I will tell you that, kind of like watching the Star Wars movies out of order, I have enjoyed the game just fine getting through A Realm Reborn, because actually there's something different about my experience where I meet somebody for the first time, but I already know that we have a relationship with them. And so there is something very cool about kind of messing with time in this way, where I'm enjoying it just fine. It is less pure than the other two methods, because sometimes a character comes along and they're like, oh my gosh, what if this character dies? Or what if this character doesn't die? And like, I already know the answer, and so I would tell you, stay as high on that list as possible, but there are different methods to get into this game narratively.
Explained and fully documented, you'll never be unsure of what does what. It's just a remarkably slow start. Now, while it can indeed be played as a high-quality single-player adventure, it's also one of the most successful RPGs of all time, with MMO population putting it as the 5th most popular MMO with about 2 million daily.
I believe we are now, so we are over 25 million total players. I believe we've moved into the number 2 slot. Briefly, it was rumored that we'd passed WoW when they were going through some struggle, but I think they're back on top. And so I believe in any of the MMO metric sites, which these are all just guessing, I believe it's number 2. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that you have a lot of people to play with. Earlier, he mentioned that if you create a character on the same world, you would be able to play with your friends, but you can actually play on the same data center, which is a group of worlds. And in 6.18, which is right around the corner at the time of this filming, we will actually be able to jump even data centers, which will give you access to all servers that are within your region. The regions being North America, EU, Japan, and past Josh wouldn't know this, but now supporting Oceanic as well.
Active players. The Final Fantasy XIV community is thriving with in-game guilds or free companies constantly recruiting and adventuring together, an extremely active subreddit, YouTube and Twitch communities, and even a real-life restaurant, the Eorzea Cafe in Japan. Final Fantasy XIV has become a major success, both financially and culturally. The main cities in the game are always super populated, and when I logged in, I had to join a queue. You know a game is doing well when there's a queue to log in. When you start playing Final Fantasy XIV, you'll be a low-level messenger passing items or notes back and forth for a few hours. Then about 3 or 4 days in, you'll get to adventure around the wilds and experience some more complex combat and enemies. Then 3 or 4 weeks in, you'll start running the low to mid-level dungeons with other players. It's vital to remember this is a long-term game aimed at long-term players. There's thousands of hours of content here and it's dished out to you very slowly, but if you take your time and appreciate the journey more than the destination, you'll find a brilliant game here. The main story quest, or MSQ, will take a long time to finish. Even though they've recently streamlined the whole process, it's not a quick experience, and the expansions will again see you dedicating a good few weeks of solid to casual play to beat them. As of now, there are 3 major expansions. The free trial included Heaven's Ward, then Stormblood, then finally Shadowbringers. Each brings new classes, new items, new armor, and a massive amount of new enemies and areas to explore, as well as pushing the central storyline forward. Even though you can buy a level boost and get yourself straight to the end immediately, that is not and never has been the point of the game. The adventure is the draw here. Starting from the beginning and getting to the end is the fun bit. Jumping to the end will not give you anywhere near a fair experience of this game. So should you play Final Fantasy XIV in 2021? There are several factors, if I'm being honest, that put me off this game. I'm not a fan of the very slow start, from the tedious fetch quest to the monotonous early game combat, or the immense amount of very plot-heavy cutscenes and long conversations thrown at you so quickly before you've had a chance to really establish yourself in this world. And because of this early game experience, Final Fantasy XIV always felt off-putting to me, which is super annoying because once you reach the mid to end game, it's a lot of fun. You start to understand your place in the world, then the combat opens up and shows its true strengths. I think if you're going to play Final Fantasy XIV in 2021, you should try the very generous free trial and then even consider the relatively affordable monthly subscription, but also keep in mind that the early game experience is weak and not representative of the heights of quality it does eventually reach. So yes, give it a go and give it your best shot to get invested in the story and adventure through Eorzea.
I do think that as quantity of trial, I think that it is one of the largest amounts of free gameplay in an otherwise paid game, without comparing it to free-to-play games. But I don't think that first 100 hours or 200 hours is representative of everything that you would be doing at endgame. And I think that of the two, I would say that the one you're not seeing is the stronger set of content. And so I would say that if you clear only the free trial content, you're missing out on a lot of the social aspects. You're missing out on a lot of the later types of content. You're missing out on a lot of the refinement to the systems you are seeing. The fates, the quests, the zones, those are all things that the newer zones, the newer fates, the newer story, the newer dungeons, all, in my opinion, strengthen. Now, as they become aware of this, they have gone back and they've revisited a lot of the 2.0 dungeons. That's since previous Josh here. They've gone back and revisited MSQ, which previous Josh notes. And so they've done a lot to try to improve this, but it is still not punching nearly as well as the ability to get in and experience a wide variety of content in something like Guild Wars 2 base game, or the Exiles Reach starting zone in World of Warcraft, which does a decent job of saying, hey, maybe you've never played an MMO. Here's kind of what WoW is like. It's not as good as Endgame. There's no way to show something that complex to somebody totally new, but it is a lot better than here's 2 abilities on a 2.5 second global, and here's 100 hours of very rarely voiced, and when it is poorly voiced, things here, where I think a lot of the voice work is something that was talented voice actors, talented writers, but the whole 2.0 was built in like around 18 months as they took 1.0 offline and had to try to relaunch the game with limited time and limited resources. And so I think a lot of the people involved are probably better and more talented today than they were then, and many of them are still involved with the project. But I think also just had they had the resources and time that they're able to put into each expansion now, I think they admit that while they're proud of where this game has gotten them and where it has been along the way, that if they knew everything that they knew today, back then, they would have done some of it a little bit differently. And so hopefully the new player experience, which unfortunately is likely the weakest point of Final Fantasy XIV, continues to strengthen, because the unfortunate thing about that being the weak section is it is the section that our newest players experience first. And so they are having to push through something instead of starting with some of the greatest content added to the game and then working their way backward, where anytime there is a mistake or something doesn't quite land right or the pacing's a little off, your love for the game can kind of help cover that.
Be willing to give this game a few weeks to click, because it does get better. It just doesn't have the best start. Cheers for watching. Let me know in the comments below.
I am so excited to kind of go back through this in 2022 and decide, is this game still worth it? I think that it is more worth it than it's ever been. I think 2020, Josh, had a lot of great reasons why people should give this a shot and what they might enjoy about it. I think veteran players are even more aware coming into 2021 what is exciting about it. And as we move through time and you think about the build up to the launch of Endwalker, now being in Endwalker, which is one of the greatest MMO expansions I have ever played in my life and likely ever will, because it is layered with things like 10 years of build up, a game that is in a really healthy state, a community that was booming. It's a really exciting time to be in Final Fantasy XIV, but thankfully it is doing that at a time that it is exciting to be in MMOs in general. Guild Wars 2 is crushing it. I am cautiously optimistic that Dragonflight will be good for WoW. New World still has people that are really enjoying it. And so I think as we look, and then we look into games that are somewhat adjacent as we move into action RPGs with things like Lost Ark and all of that, and everything that is on the horizon as of this filming, it is a great time to be an MMO player, but specifically a great time to be Final Fantasy. In Final Fantasy XIV, in my unbelievably biased opinion, the strongest MMO currently on the market. Kinda.